Hello, everybody. I thought today, just for a change, and to remind you that we are actually in a class on English literature, we would look at a poem. And what better poem to look at than a sonnet by William Shakespeare? I know the approach that we're taking may be unfamiliar to some of you. Because and I guess maybe in American literature, Professor Kramer does this as well. And I know Dr. Feldman will do it in the 18th century. So it's the thing we do. Like we talk about the things that are around the works that we're reading in order to understand them, right? Because we need to know the languages that they're speaking. If we don't know the languages they're speaking, we can't read them. We have to know what they're invested in. And it's not because we need to know what they're invested in and we can agree with them. They're using a language. We need to figure out how they're using it. So we have been talking, it's just like a little break before we look at Hoby. And Hoby is a guide to the courtier and to a certain kind of what we will refer to as self-fashioning. And we've talked about a lot about the self, the Protestant emphasis on the self. And you can see that even in Shakespeare, not an explicitly religious writer, but obviously his as you'll see, I hope, his works are suffused with Christianity and the frameworks, the schemes, the pictures, the world pictures that it gives, because he gets to play with it, right? That's what great authors do. They inherit forms and they play with them. And by playing with them, they make meaning. I mean, Shakespeare's sonnet here is a perfect example. Isn't there like two kinds of sonnet, Petrarchan and Shakespearean? So I want to ask you which kind of sonnet this is. Shakespearean sonnets are 4-4-4-2. He gets a lot of punch out of the last two lines. Let's read it together. This is a love poem, or it's a poem about love. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. True minds don't admit obstacles. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. Love is no longer love. It is not defined as love when it changes, or bends with a remover to remove, or is dependent upon being present. When one person leaves, or bends with the remover to remove. The remover, the person who's walking out, that's a weird, just Shakespeare puts it really weirdly, or bends with the remover to remove. I think the implication here is I have to work it out a little better, or bends with the remover to remove. There's no sense of distance here. And how do I know I'm on the right track from the next line? Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempest and is never shaken, occupies a certain space, never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. I think that's the distance of the star. We don't know the height of it, and whose worth's, I'm not sure. Love's not time's fool, the rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error, upon me proved, I never read, nor no man ever loved. Very coy at the end in a way, no? These lines are terrific, right? Love's not time's fool, right? This is the third quatrain, I think, right? Yes, it is. What's a quatrain? 4-4-4-2. Love's not time's fool, the rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love is not time's fool, which means love is not subject to time, but it is the rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Very poetic way of saying that, yeah, certain kind of beauty fades, maybe certain kind of love fades. Love, we said it was independent of space, it's also independent of time, alters not with his brief hours and weeks, doesn't change over time, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. It's almost apocalyptic here, of doomsday. Here we're getting a sense suddenly, it comes really as a kind of surprise, a very, it's doom has a very strong religious connotation. Judgment, end, doomsday, that whole thing. So on the one hand, we have like time being infinite and love being infinite, transcending time. But now at the end here, but it bears it out even to the edge of doom, there's a sense that it is finite. or maybe to the end of time is in some way anticipating the end of time. Maybe I'm reading it too darkly. If this be error, this is what we'll focus on, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Here Shakespeare is working out, and Shakespeare kind of like plays chess inside of your brain, right? And Shakespeare is the easiest, not the easiest, not the hardest of all the poets we'll read. His language is clear. It's not, doesn't, we'll see a poet like John Donne will make it hard for us to imagine even what he's talking about. Shakespeare doesn't do that. That's not to underestimate the complexity of the sonnet here, and especially those last two lines, which Shakespeare is clearly thinking about the relationship between writing and love. And without the writer, there is no love. Because, why would that be? Because the writer creates the metaphors that make the impossible possible. I think maybe the starting point is that love is kind of miraculous. In Shakespeare's comedies, we'll read one, it's magic. And so is poetry. Performs a kind of magic. What's the magic? The two people who are separate can feel like they're together. You see, we've been talking about eyes, the creation of the self. On Monday, we focused really on national identity, but we've been starting to talk about personal identity as well. And with that, we will now make a transition, elegant as that, to, let's see how elegant this is going to turn out. Yes. Very, you see, this is like, this is not good. This like thing over here, untitled, we pay enough for this thing. Okay, now who is this guy? I'm going to re-emphasize to you the necessity of being present to the work that we read. In order to do that, you need to find out the context, because otherwise none of it makes sense. It's hard, right? And I am not going to tell you what it means, meaning I am going to help us work together to figure out what things mean. But I'm going to count on you in ways that perhaps I haven't in the past, to be ready to read the stuff, to be ready to say, I don't get this, I don't understand. Why are we reading this? I want to hear those questions. Now, Castiglione was a Spanish courtier, I think. And the reason we read it, I mean, why is it relevant to the English context, is because it was translated by this guy, Thomas Hoby, I think. And became extremely popular in England. I think I refer to the courtier is in the genre of the advice book. Different writers give different forms of advice. What do we mean by advice? Well, the advice is how to be successful. The first of this kind, or the first and most important in the modern world, is Machiavelli's The Prince. Machiavelli has very specific advice for the prince for him to be successful, right? Some of us know what that is, to be, what is Machiavelli's advice to the prince? To be Machiavellian, right? He's become a metaphor for being underhanded. Figure out the vulnerabilities of your enemy and take advantage of them. It is not virtuous to be virtuous, or virtue doesn't matter, right? But here, Castiglione is giving, and I'll just use the word, say Hoby, it's easier for me. For Hoby, it's to the courtier. The prince wants to learn how to rule. The courtier wants to learn. We already talked a little bit about this. The courtier wants to learn how he can ascend in the court. One of the reasons that the court was growing so, everything is kind of connected in the story that we're telling, is because of the growth of the Elizabethan economy, the winning of the Spanish, the victory of at the Spanish Armada, the wool trade, London becoming, like it is today on a smaller scale, like an international hub of trade. So suddenly London is becoming a capital which changes England into England, meaning in the past there were separate realms of power. I think we might have mentioned briefly feudal lords, right? The feudal system. You can, I'm not Googling that now. The feudal system is, as we said, a feudal lord, sense of dependence between the feudal lord and the serfs who work on his property. You had many powerful lords in different parts of England, kind of a Game of Thrones vibe. That's where they get it from, right? But by the time of Elizabeth and London, London is on the ascension and England is on the ascension. Now, so the court is growing. Court does various things. We said administrative, diplomatic. We'll be reading Sir Philip Sidney, who was an actual diplomat. The court was where the action was. It's where the money was. It's where the glory was. It was where the power was. And everybody wanted a piece of that. I mean, for some people, it was totally inaccessible. For some people, it was just natural by birth, right? Hoby is addressing the middle, right? The people who don't have it by birth, but who by accident of maybe education is changing, maybe becoming more democratic. Somebody they're getting close to the realms of power. And this book is for those who want to come even closer. How it's really in the 1950s, there was a famous book, the first self-help book, How to Make Friends and Influence People. And in a way, that's what Hoby is doing in this work. Hoby, the translator, is that he is giving those hungry for power possibility, hope, right? You can also do it. Remember, we're coming out of this is a transition period between a culture where there is no middle class, right? They're in very schematic and broad terms, they're serfs and they're in feudal lords. Now, all of a sudden, there's like a middle class. Again, we said that money matters here because a lot of the wealthy middle class became wealthy through retail, wholesale and retail, right? Selling stuff. They became middlemen. The great chain of being, what undid it, probably in the end, most of all, I mean, Luther, is money. Because money that when before you had this, you had to stay where you were because that's where God wanted you. But now there's this chance of this possibility of mobility. Okay. So Hoby is writing for that audience, right? You want to be successful, you want to make it, you want to hang out in the king's court, in the queen's court, buy this book, right? But as we'll see, the first line, if you can actually follow it to its end, I'm just going to prepare you. It ends 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down. If you're in the self-help section and you pick up this book, what would you do after you read this first line? Perhaps I'm able to tell you what a perfect courtier ought to be, but not to teach you how you should do to be one. I'll put this one back, right? Is there another one? He says, I can teach you the theory of being a courtier. I can teach it to you in the abstract, but I can't teach you how to be one. Not very encouraging, right? one of the things that's characteristic about the way Hoby is writing is that he goes back and forth. He keeps on saying something and then undermining it. Does that mean he's contradicting himself? No, it means he's trying to express two things at once. Watch the shift here. Notwithstanding, meaning, even though I just said I can't do it, to fulfill your grace in what I am able, he's writing it for somebody. To fulfill your request in what I am able, although it be in manner, a qualification, in a proverb, mashal, that grace is not to be learned, I say unto you, whoso mindeth to be gracious, to have a good grace in the exercises of the body, if you carry yourself graciously, presupposing first that he be not of nature unapt, meaning, again, you've got somebody, you have, if you want to be in mind to be gracious, there's a prerequisite. You have to not be completely out of shape, right? Let's pick it up. I say unto you, whoso mindeth to be gracious, or to have good grace in the exercises of the body, somebody wants this, presupposing, good word, assuming first that he be not of nature unapt, he's not uncoordinated, ought to begin betimes and to learn his principles of cunning men. So this is a little bit Machiavellian, right? By Machiavellian, we think of the cunning person, the person who sees behind the scenes and knows how to manipulate. It's interesting that Hoby starts out with, I'll tell you what a perfect courtier is. And then by the end, he's saying, well, if you fulfill the following qualifications, well, you better start learning soon, because it might be too late. You ought to begin betimes and to learn the principles of cunning men. So what does the cunning man do? We're not using we don't have to worry about gendered pronouns because there are only men in this context. I mean, not entirely true. There were aristocratic women, but let's stay away from them. Women did not have the same opportunities for upward mobility as men did, right? That was one hierarchy that stayed in place. Okay, so let's see. So what is the advice that he gives? What is the advice of a cunning man? So here, and let's not be confused by the quotation mark. Apparently, it's a part of a larger work where people are speaking this out. This does seem to be a pretty normative perspective, meaning a perspective that the author himself is advocating. So let's pay attention here. But I, imagining with myself oftentimes how this grace cometh, leaving apart such as habit from above. Oh, let's pause here. We didn't sit on this enough. What does grace mean? So grace can be social grace, or it can be grace, which I think is a translation from the Hebrew rachamim, right? They have that word grace, which means, interestingly, the social grace you have is, in some sense, you could see how that idea would fit into an aristocratic perspective. If you have social grace, it's because you're closer to the divine. That is, there's a connection between grace, social grace, and the grace from above. Although here he distinguishes it. Let's read it again. But I, imagining with myself oftentimes how this grace cometh, leaving apart such as have it from above, so there are people who have it from above, find one rule that is most general, which in this part, methink, taketh place in all things, belonging to man in word or deed above the other. Whether he's speaking, whether he's acting, this has to be emphasized. And that is to eschew. Everybody Google eschew. What does that mean? To put aside as much as a man may, because it's going to be impossible. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. And that is to eschew as much as a man may, and as a sharp and dangerous rock. I think that must be a Homeric reference, right? Scylla and Charybdis. We didn't read it, but we talked about it, the whirlpool and the giant rock thing. And as a sharp and dangerous rock, affectation. What does it mean when somebody's affected? They're putting on an affect. Curiosity here has a different meaning than the one we're using. Curiosity has the same meaning. Also, curiosity means to dress in an intentionally curious manner, not to be curious, to elicit curiosity, and to speak a new word. So you have to avoid affectation or curiosity. Don't put things on. And to speak a new word, to use everything in a certain recklessness. So that's a weird translation. The original Italian, and you might have heard this, is sprezzatura. And sprezzatura, you might have heard it. Oh, look at this. It's invented by our person. Sprezzatura is an Italian word that first appears in Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. So somebody else, they say it's certain, I don't want to make this too big here. It's a certain nonchalance. Do you see where it says that? A certain nonchalance. Oh, is that what that's a quotation? Oh, well, they're translating it differently. Let's go back to our quotation, so we'll be less confused. Yeah. Right. So can you see what can we extrapolate from the two translations, neither one of which is sufficient, but both together do a little bit of the work. What recklessness and nonchalance have in common? Like nonchalance implies not really caring. It's partly that. Recklessness implies, going for it. And sprezzatura is kind of in between. It's like going for it, but doing it easily. If you've ever seen great athletes or great musicians, like they can simultaneously be like completely relaxed and completely concentrated. A little different here, but so that's the word sprezzatura, a certain recklessness, or to cover art withal, and seem whatsoever he doth and saith to do it without pain, and as it were, not minding it. I'm guessing not minding it means not being self-conscious about it. Let's see. I need the notes. Not noticing it. Okay. Let's see. Oh, here recklessness, i.e. nonchalance. Oh, I don't know. I mean, so neither one is good. Let's go back. To cover art withal, and seem whatsoever he doth and saith to do it without pain, as it were not minding it, not noticing it, not paying attention. This is how I act. The strange thing here is, and this is what we're getting to cover art withal, is Hoby is giving the paradoxical advice and saying, act naturally. And we use that as an idiom in which it makes sense. But for Hoby, there's the acting, which is putting on a show and being natural. Seeming to act natural. That's, Hamlet says in Hamlet, he says, I know at the very beginning when he's very naive, before he decides to play, he says, I know not seems, but Castiglione is representing a world of seems. If we're tempted to look at ourselves as somehow superior to this, just think about Facebook, right? Or Instagram or whatever you guys are using. And how that is also a form of self-presentation that aspires to look completely natural. I'm completely at ease in this $80,000 car. Well, yes, that's me in that $190,000 yacht, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating, but right? Like my life is so great and I'm hardly even working on it, right? So, and that's why Hoby says earlier, as much as a man may, meaning it's not easy. He understands that. Let's continue. And of this do I believe grace is much derived, for in rare matters and well brought to pass. Let's skip a little bit down. Let's just read this last sentence here, because that will really, I think, express more clearly what we've just been saying. Therefore, here, that may be said to be a very art that appeareth not to be art. We talked last time about the problem with images. It's kind of like that here. It's not theological, but right, there's too much art, too much show is a tell. Someone who once owned a falafel store and made $1 million jillion in high tech will show up one day wearing an oversized Armani suit, a big gold chain, and driving, a convertible BMW. But you'll see that he's new money because he doesn't have that ease with it. The royal family years ago, especially now King Charles, would dress in the most casual. He would always seem to be about to go hunting or something, right? And that was because he doesn't have to prove anything, right? Therefore, that may be said to be a very art that appears not to be art. As soon as you're caught out as trying, you're out. You see also this, like, why people want to buy this, because they don't want to make the same mistakes that others are making, because it must be very, very competitive. Therefore, that may be said to be a very art that appeareth not to be art. Neither ought a man to put more diligence in anything than in covering it. For in case it be open, it loses credit clean and maketh a man little said by. Meaning, if the curtain, if the costume or the mask comes off, well, that's really bad, because then you're revealed for what you really are, which is a failed social climber. So it's the person who can look at ease at the cocktail party, wherever in Ramat Aviv or whatever. You have to be able to look like you fit in. If you're looking like you're trying to fit in, you're already out. So here again, art is being really used in a kind of cynical sense here. You use art as a way to cover, and through that covering to show yourself worthy of a certain kind of mobility. This really is the beginning, as I said earlier, of a kind of self-fashioning. What I mean by that is making of the self. Shakespeare would be great to learn the 150 sonnets of Shakespeare. I think there are as many Shakespeareans, maybe it's not, maybe it's 125. To read all of them and to see the shape of the poem and how art gets represented and writing gets represented and love gets represented. But we do see that connection between love, between metaphor and love. That's something, to really continue to think about what metaphor is able to do, or what the claim is that metaphor can do. And again, I'm in a way suggesting that you wipe everything away and assume, and I think this would be the simple reading of the world, that love is impossible. Maybe. I don't know. Because people are always Machiavellian. It's like Machiavellian, he describes how people really are. So how do you transcend that, how people really are, to bring people who see themselves as opposed and fighting? How do you bring them together? Shakespeare says through metaphor and poetry. That's Shakespeare for you. Okay, people, good to see you. I'm not sure what we'll do next time, but I think we're done for the day.